What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 213. I'm the host, Kyle Anslone, talking about Russia on today's show, things going on in Ukraine, Kazakhstan, the upcoming talks this week between the U.S. and Russia. Very important things happening, the potential for conflict in Ukraine. I'll be breaking all that down. And then some other news on China and Yemen. It'll be a great show to share, so if you can, head on over to the Libertarian Institute where the show is hosted and go ahead and share the show from there. You could subscribe to the show just about anywhere you could listen to different shows. We had the video version up on YouTube, Rumble, and Odyssey. Anywhere you could listen to audio podcasts. It's also on the Libertarian Institute all podcast feed alongside the Scott Horton Show, Liberty Weekly, Don't Tread on Anyone, Year Zero. So tons of great content at the Institute. Be sure to check out what we're doing there. Follow, subscribe, recommend, share the show, anything you could do. If you'd like to donate to the show, help us out, of course you do that by supporting antiwar.com or the Libertarian Institute, but you can also donate directly to the show at either Patreon or Subscribestar, and also the crypto information is in the show notes page. Another way you could help the show out, and this way you benefit quite a bit yourself as well, is by doing your CBD shopping at Paloma Verde. PalomaVerdeCBD.com is the URL. The promo code is PEACE, and that'll save you 25% off when you spend $75 or more, and the show gets a kit bag. So it's a fantastic deal for the show when you do your CBD shopping there. They have lots of great products at Paloma Verde. Everything's high quality, lab tested results right there on their website. Soft gels, gummies, Edstrats, all kinds of topicals, even products for your dog. A lot of my audience are libertarians. I know libertarians are pretty familiar with CBD. A lot of you use CBD, have different reasons for it, whether it's falling asleep at night, helping with anxiety, or, just helping with some pain. There's probably something that can help you at Paloma Verde. Help out the show, help yourself. All right, now let's get into the episode. The first story we have today is just talking about the upcoming meeting between, it's going to be Wendy Sherman and then also the undersecretary of the Russian Foreign Ministry, so Sergei Lavrov's deputy, and they're going to be meeting in Vienna on the 10th. And then there's also a scheduled meeting, I believe it's in Brussels, between a Russian delegation and a NATO delegation, which I'm sure will also include the US, but then other European partners as well. So, if you're listening to this show, you're probably doing it on the 9th or the 10th of January here. And so we're hopefully going to get some news about what's happening at these talks coming out. Initially, I was pretty optimistic about what could come here. The U.S. said the Russian proposal was something they'd be willing to talk about. Putin removed 10,000 troops from the, border region on Christmas. Biden had talked about Blinken, somebody in the State Department, a senior State Department official, had apparently communicated to the Ukrainians they would be unlikely to join NATO for the next 10 years. And so it seemed like we were on the positive path to, having these talks be set up for a diplomatic success. And then this past week happened, and all the rhetoric coming out of all the meetings going on between the U.S. and other NATO officials and meetings between various NATO states was all very suggesting that these talks aren't going to go particularly well. And so first story I have here is from antiwar.com, date to camp on January 7th. U.S. NATO reject Russia call for halt of eastward expansion. Dave writes, on Friday, U.S. and NATO rejected a Russian call for the military alliance to halt eastward expansion amid tensions around Ukraine. Russia submitted a series of security proposals to the U.S., and chief among the Russian requests was the guarantee that Ukraine won't join NATO. I think, this is Kyle Anslone's commentary here again, I think that was probably the most important part of the Russian proposal. And maybe I'm misreading Russia a little bit on this, and they're actually more concerned about potential new weapons deployments to Ukraine than Ukraine actually joining NATO itself. But those would likely, I think, be the top two concerns, and probably the ones that Russia is least likely to negotiate on, right? Like talking about the military exercises that Russia doesn't want going on in Eastern European states, removing weapons that are already in place in European states, are probably things that Russia would be, I would hope, willing to negotiate on, because I doubt the U.S. would just reverse its policy in Eastern Europe back to like 2008, and that's kind of what Russia is asking for here, to go back to a little bit of simpler times where you didn't have NATO pushed all the way up to Russia's border, and a plan of action for both Ukraine and the country of Georgia, which is one of the Caucasus countries in the south of Georgia there. I guess between the Caspian and the Black Sea, maybe. Not looking at a map, but that region of the world right there is where Georgia is. And so, these are countries that are countries that are very close to Russian population centers. As Dub Bondow points out, that these aren't even countries that joined Russia as a part of the USSR, but rather as a part of the Russian Empire. These are long-standing Russian countries. These are two countries in 2008 where the U.S. provoked an invasion of the Georgian government of a border area between Georgia and NATO that was under the protection of Russian peacekeepers, because the people in that area when the Soviet Union was falling apart, much like the people of the Donbass region, are, I think, more ethnically Russian and not as interested in being a part of like a Georgian or Ukrainian like government in Kiev, a very Western oriented government. And so in both of those cases, those provoked Russian reactions, where in Ukraine's case in 2014, the Crimean Peninsula was seized, and Georgia, I think 2009, this probably happens at South Ossetia, that is taken back by the Russian state and all of this. And then, of course, Russian peacekeepers remain deployed in Georgia, and then also in the, not peacekeepers, but Russia remains supporting of the separatists in the Donbass region of Ukraine. And so these are two pretty clear red lines for Russia, and they're asking, I think, the U.S. to stop meddling there in particular, and to stop threatening to expand NATO into these countries. And from what we're hearing from the meeting between the secretaries of state and everything of the NATO member countries, they're going to reject that. And so I'm seeing reports today that both sides are not very optimistic about these talks, that Russia is expecting them to be short. And so this doesn't look like a good sign. Now, there are, I guess, a couple other things that I will just float out there that I think are important to note. That sometimes the statements of the government, even to other governments, like the Ukrainian government or the government of Germany or France, that are publicly put out by the U.S. and our NATO allies, might not actually reflect the actual position of Joe Biden on this. And so, this creates a couple possibilities. One is that Antony Blinken, who's the Secretary of State, is kind of out on his own here and pushing the war agenda. Wouldn't be unsurprising. We've seen this plenty of times in administrations, and not just with like Mike Pompeo and Donald Trump, but Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama or something like that. We could go back and look at other secretaries of state that were very hawkish. And so it could really be that, Blinken is out pushing a narrative that isn't necessarily backed by Joe Biden. Joe Biden, for whatever reason, domestic concerns, mental incapabilities, is unable to see what his Secretary of State is doing behind his back, or that they're like hawking it up this week and prior to the actual meetings with Russia, because they're planning on making some concessions. And if you kind of floated beforehand that you're going to make concessions, then the hawks in the United States are going to line up against you. And all this week, they're going to be running op-eds in the Washington Post and the New York Times and USA Today and the Hill and everywhere else about how Joe Biden is giving up on Europe and he's worse than Donald Trump. And I guarantee you that would be the narrative. And so maybe this is a PR move. It's not impossible that that's the case, and that the negotiations are going to signal positions that are far more willing to compromise, or that, you know, in private, the U.S. is going to extend to Russia that, hey, look, you know, we can't actually revoke Ukraine's eventual bid to be a NATO member, but we're going to promise you, not going to put it in writing, not going to leave this room, but the Russian government, Vladimir Putin, can take it to the bank that Joe Biden will absolutely not make Ukraine a NATO member. And while I'm sure that there is a sense that's a positive, right? Like that's a good understanding on the U.S., the Biden administration's part to like make a proposal like that. I'm not sure Russia will be willing to accept it. And there's a few reasons for this. And both, I think, 1990 and then 1997, the U.S. government, separate administrations, made promises to Russia about NATO expansion and various other actions that the U.S. and our Western allies would not take in Eastern Europe, that were not formal agreements, not written down, and those are absolutely shattered by the West and NATO. So it wouldn't necessarily be a surprise if Russia isn't willing to accept that. And that could be a miscalculation on the Biden administration's part, that they think that Russia will and they won't. And then what happens is a question mark and could get ugly, or it could cause the Biden administration to wake up and accept a reality. So got to talk about this interview with Aaron Mate and Douglas McGregor. McGregor is somebody I've talked about a lot on the show. Scott Horton has talked about him a lot on the show. Somebody that, you know, the anti-war community, and like particular me and Scott hold in very high regard, was talking to Aaron Mate saying that, look, an invasion of Ukraine by Russia seems very likely. And he was pointing out that the Biden administration would be unwilling to go far enough to meet the Russian demands, and that this was essentially going to be the reason for the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but that he said it as such a matter of fact that this is what's going to happen. Not that, you know, this has to be what happens, that no matter what Biden does, Russia is just going to invade Ukraine and that's the way the world has to be. But by the politics that he sees being played out here, that this is the way that it's going to go. And I guess, you know, I just say that that's a possibility. On the show, I've talked about how I really don't think Russia wants to go that route for various reasons. I don't think it would be a strategic move on like the population of Ukraine and the political balance in general of that country. If the people of the Donbass region are able to vote in national elections in Ukraine, that's going to help to create a more Russian-friendly government in Ukraine, because the people of that region are Russian-friendly. And so, you know, like if you just like made California its own republic or something like that, right? Like that's going to make the Democrat Party less influential in Washington D.C. because a huge portion of their voter base, you know, it's a democracy, quote, whatever, republic, or, you know, however you want to describe it, but basically it's like a chaotic mob versus deep state oligarchic rule that is kind of crazy, where the mom's vote is just driven by the media and everything and by the deep state. But anyways, on the front that we were talking about before in Ukraine, if, you know, again, Russia were to officially annex the Donbass region, that would, you know, take away a number of votes that would be pro-Russian. Also, you know, I think in a sense it would be like annexing the Rust Belt and, you know, areas of the country that have a lot of problems. Look, like, can you imagine if the Canadians were talking about annexing somewhere in the United States, and they were talking about like taking Wisconsin, including Kenosha, and you know, maybe like not Chicago, but most of Indiana or something like that, and just all these areas that are, you know, aging and economically struggling and dependent regions, right? It's not going to be regions that come problem free. It's going to be regions that come with economic liabilities. And so it's not, I don't think necessarily Russia's top choice to actually annex Ukraine. I think they would far prefer you know, Russian friendly, or at least a decidedly neutral Ukraine that it, you know, is committed to not allowing in NATO weapons and everything like that. But that doesn't seem to be the course that we're on. I see, even today they're talking about that we have to worry about Ukraine's territorial sovereignty and everything like this. And so, very concerning what's going to happen this week. And my guess is by the Wednesday or at the very least Friday show, I'll have an update on what actually happened during these talks and just how bad the news is. And who knows, maybe it's not that bad. All right, so let's talk about Ukraine for a minute and this story that's really only been covered in the independent media, minus an article by Time Magazine where they did a big investigation on this, and then a few other reports here and there. But this at Newsweek, a year after one sits, Ukraine's war draws U.S. far right to fight Russia, train for violence at home. And what this article is going into is it's what we talked about for a long time. There are militias in Ukraine that are straight up neo-Nazis to, whatever vaguely you want to call like far-right extremist groups, white nationalists, white supremacist type groups. And the most notable among them would be the Azov battalion that, again, on this show we've been talking about for years. And actually, I could say that if you go back and listen to episodes of Foreign Policy Focus in 2018, you could hear me saying that, one of the real risks to us backing the Ukrainian government and these Ukrainian militias is that just like what happened in the Middle East, you're going to have Americans go over there, train with these groups, become more radicalized, and then now they're able to travel back to the West or other places around the world and carry out horrendous crimes. And so we'll get into how all that happened here. But basically, there's a journalist that went over to, I think a National Geographic journalist actually went over to Ukraine and met with some members of these groups and kind of looked into the phenomenon that was going on here. And very interesting. She said, or I guess here's, I think, one of the more substantial paragraphs, asked if she had identified a trend in which U.S. extremists were joining counterparts in Ukraine to obtain battlefield experience. Van Zeller told Newsweek, yes, this is very much what we found in our investigation. So yeah, she's laying out, we interviewed members of a white supremacy group called the Atomwaffen Division. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. It's probably supposed to sound more German, who have sent members to train in Ukraine, where neo-Nazi militias have recruited white supremacists from around the world in order to join their fight against Russia's advanced racist ideology. And so, this is all done under the pretext of fighting against Russia. And all these white nationalists that we're talking about are on the same side of the war as the United States is, right? That these militias have actually been co-opted, including the Azov battalion, and made official members of the Ukrainian military, and the U.S. is arming the Ukrainian military. I mean, this has been such a problem that there's been at least 2 times where Congress, one time they just sent a letter, but it was 40 congressmen. So it's not just like Thomas Massie and Barbara Lee or something like that. There's a significant number of congressmen sending letters saying like, hey, what's going on? Are we looking into this? Maybe we should label the Azov battalion a terrorist organization. And then also in the 2018 NDAA, I don't think it actually made it into the final bill, but there was parts of that, and I'm pretty sure this was Tulsi Gabbard's like Stop Army Nazis Act, where she was really trying to push some kind of law that would prevent this from happening, the U.S. arming a military with white nationalist elements. Now, this isn't in the article, but it is something I read and did confirm this week, that in mid to late December, the Florida National Guard sent about 100 members to train near the separatist region of eastern Ukraine, which is where, at least in part, that this Azov battalion and now as a part of the National Guard is operating in Ukraine. And we also know that there are things like the prison system in Florida has like a white nationalist problem. There's white nationalist people within the Florida prison guard community and things like that. And so, you have to imagine that the Florida National Guard probably recruits from a somewhat similar community as the Florida prison guard system. And so you really have to worry about what kind of influence our National Guard troops are coming over, being deployed with these guys, these horrific people overseas. Also, this also isn't in the article, but some worth mentioning, and this is in the reporting of Mats Blumenthal at the Gray Zone about this figure, Andre Perubi, who's a fairly recognizable and high-ranking figure within the Ukrainian politics, and at one time was actually Speaker of the Parliament. This is the side of the war that the U.S. is backing. This is the government that came to power after the U.S. coup. Right? This wasn't the government that, the U.S. was overthrowing in Ukraine. This was the government that the U.S. was backing in Ukraine. And the reason that this is so significant to like what's happening between Russia and Ukraine now is the reason that the U.S. is backing this side is it's because the most fiercely anti-Russian side, right? And so this is all about making sure there's a government in Ukraine that's favorable to the United States, and to the degree so that they would be willing to join NATO and continue to buy boatloads of U.S. weapons. I think more nefariously, there are people within the U.S. deep state who understand that this is a pressure point for Russia, and that Russia is going to do things like move troops into the region with Ukraine. Now, I still would put a huge asterisk on this 100,000 troop number, especially since they've been using the same number before and after Christmas, when Russia announced, and no opposition or nobody is disputed, that Russia did move 10,000 troops. And so you would think that number should at least come to 90,000, in most of the reporting, but it doesn't. They just keep it at 100,000, right? And so this is all very, very important here, that the U.S. is backing these elements in Ukraine, and that it's all about the geopolitics of creating a low simmering tension with Russia to continue to weapon sales and have a need for NATO for years and years to come. I think that's part of the reason why when the U.S. was willing to think about the proposal that Putin put forward, it was the NATO head John Stoltenberg that came out immediately and was denouncing it as a non-starter and everything like that. So in this article, they have this statement that they got from the State Department, right? So, they're asking questions about supporting these elements in Ukraine and everything like that. And the State Department doesn't say give their boilerplate response to, we're committed to fighting extremism around the globe and even within the ranks of blah, 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 right? Nothing like that. They say the United States is committed to Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity in the face of unprovoked Russian aggression. And so this statement absolutely confirms what I was just talking about, that the United States government, through administrations that included Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and now Joe Biden, are more than willing to back white nationalists, neo-Nazi elements in Ukraine, even understanding the risk, and we'll talk about it in a second to get into what the risk is, that there are going to be white nationalist elements, people in the United States who go and train, become more radicalized, more familiar with weapons and battlefield tactics in Ukraine, and then potentially travel back to the United States. And so there's actually a couple examples of this. The New Zealand Christ Church shooter, who, this is the person whose manifesto was heavily redacted online and everything like that. And I believe he filmed himself killing dozens of people. And I think it was on Facebook Live, a very disturbing story. He had gone to Ukraine at least a couple of times and talked about that in his manifesto. We have this guy in the United States, I believe his last name is Lance, and he went to Ukraine and then came back to the United States, was robbing a house and killed 2 people. And so, this isn't necessarily the case of this guy, went to Ukraine, decided that he really, hated darker skinned people, and came back and like hung to black men or something like that. I didn't exactly, wasn't clear what exactly happened in that case, but it seemed to be that it was primarily a burglary, but he resulted right to murdering. And so, I'm sure being around absolute neo-Nazi lunatics makes you more likely to be a killer of anyone. And, just when you're breaking into a home or something like that. By the way, this guy actually fled back to Ukraine after he did this. His name is Craig Lang, by the way, and I think actually is still in Ukraine and was potentially going to meet with Van Zeller, the interviewer for National Geographic, while they were making this documentary before declining to do so. But there's also been 6 other citizens that have been charged with the role of torturing separatists. So that would be, Russian-backed forces in the fight against Ukraine. And, these are the kind of elements that the U.S. is going to charge our American citizens associated with war crimes and everything like that, but at the same time we're going to continue to arm this force. It's absolutely unbelievable. So this is, I think, one of the more damning articles I've ever seen. They even have a picture here for people who are watching the video version. If you're not, it's the Ukrainian version of the Tiki Torch March. Essentially, they got a bunch of Azov guys marching through the streets with their torches and things like that. This is very disturbing stuff going on. The U.S. is backing all of it in the name of fighting Russia and combating Russia. And again, from the more nefarious elements, creating this guaranteed conflict between the U.S. and Russia to facilitate arms sales. And I want to talk about what's going on in Kazakhstan. And this is one of those places where we have reports now that after a week of unrest, the health officials say that 164 people have been killed. Those are government numbers. It vaguely accurate, maybe it's right on, maybe it's like a tenth of the actual people that were killed. Who actually knows? They also say that 5,800 people have been arrested. It seems very likely and has been reported that some of the dead are among security forces. And I did see reporting that, was a BBC journalist. So I would actually expect them to be more anti-government, Kazakhstan government and pro-protester that was showing that government buildings have been vandalized and arson burned down, that government vehicles have been burned. And so it did seem like there was quite a lot of violence on at least each side of this thing, and that, maybe protest isn't the best way to put it, and that this was like a full-on riot. Now, I've seen several different suggestions as far as what's going on here. They vary from U.S. color-coded revolution, no actual movement against the government in Kazakhstan that's not backed by the United States, to this had nothing to do with the United States and was all just a natural uprising to a authoritarian government. And of course, the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. There's a pretty good article by Moon of Alabama that I think makes the best case for the U.S. involved color-coded revolution. There are a lot of civil society groups in Kazakhstan that are backed by the United States, but at the same time, there are things happening in that country that do seem, like people living in poverty and like very, very deep poverty, and the government getting rich and contracts being decided by the government and certain groups being cut out. I won't go into too much detail about all that yet because I'm not exactly sure what's exactly happening, but it would not surprise me if a government was doing that. And so I'm sure there's a natural need, or not natural need, but there's a within Kazakhstan, without any foreign interference, there is a festering group of people who, from protest to militia, I don't know what it is, are, angry at the government and are willing to act on that anger, right? Again, I'm not sure how far they're willing to go or everything or like that, especially without U.S. help or influence, but I'm sure that exists in Kazakhstan, and it could have in part been what was acted on here. And I think that this, if we look at what's happened in like Iran in recent years, this is essentially what happens, right? When the government does something particularly bad, or, just the economy is really bad, and then the government has to make some tough choices, whichever way you want to put that. And I'm sure, there's a lot of corruption in Iran, and the elite of that country do very well, while other people live in a lot of poverty, and there's a lot of oppression and all that kind of stuff, right? But it's when protests start, it seems like the U.S. really attempts to capitalize on them, to fuel them, to make them as big as possible. And so I wonder if that's kind of what happened here in Kazakhstan, where the protests happened and then the U.S. civil society groups kicked into full gear to try to turn this into a bigger deal. Now, there's also one other possibility I just want to mention, and some people are pointing this out, and that it could have been essentially not like false flag by Russia, but a move by Russia to create instability in Kazakhstan, to get more influence within that country, because through I think it's the Collective Security Treaty Organization, CSTO. It's not the Warsaw Pact, but it is Russia's kind of alliance with some former Soviet states, including Kazakhstan, sent troops to that country. And it could have been the country's leader, looking to have, maybe seeing the Russian troops as potentially absolute security force, right? And so once you had those troops there, you can't be overthrown. So he generates this. And then the one other thing I saw is that maybe this is outside of the United States, but really not necessarily a popular uprising either, and has more to do with different factions in Kazakhstan. So this is basically, the Republican and the Democratic leadership duking it out, and not necessarily being generated by desires and needs for the people, but from themselves, but rather them being either radicalized or, bribed to by the leadership of that country to, try to make a power play for the leadership. Of course, the U.S. condemned what Russia was doing in Kazakhstan, and I think Antony Blinken gave like a warning, saying something along the lines of, once you get these Russian troops in your country, it's really hard to get them to leave, which is hilarious, since Iraq can still get the U.S. troops to leave 20 years later, and Pakistan still has drones flying over their country from the United States. So just a lot of interesting things from the U.S. comments and all that, and I'm sure I'll report more on Kazakhstan as I learn a little bit more. But I am pretty skeptical of the color-coded revolution narrative, at least to be seen. And again, if you want the best narrative on that so far I've read, it is at the Move Alabama website. The U.S. is deploying 200 National Guard soldiers from Kentucky to Kosovo. This is, a part of the UN, I believe, or maybe just NATO mission to that country, resulting from, the conflict there in the 1990s. And I don't know a lot about it, but, one of the reasons I want to point this out is a lot of states are using their National Guard for various kinds of COVID relief. And here we are sending our National Guard around the world to play geopolitics and everything like that. Just kind of makes me think that the U.S. government is as serious about COVID as they claim to be sometimes. This from Reuters: U.S. to open special operation forces base in Albania. And I feel like it kind of suggests in this article that this base will remain and stay in that case, but it does say on a rotational basis. And so I'm not sure if maybe it will only be the headquarters on a rotational basis and exist all the time, or if the base will actually only exist itself for a select period of time. But that is more U.S. forces going to be in Europe. The U.S. also sanctioned a Bosnian Serb leader over corruption charges. I'm not sure what the geopolitics or all this are, and why this person is being sanctioned and not somebody else in Bosnia, but just, again, something I want to mention. And we'll end the Russia segment on a little bit of good news, and that is the U.S., Russia, and China say a nuclear war must never be fought because, there are no winners in a nuclear war. And so it's absolutely great that this statement comes out, but unfortunately none of these states are really doing anything, and particularly the U.S. being the worst among them, to reduce the number of nuclear weapons or the likelihood that they're going to be used. Now let's talk about China. This from just before the new year, from Newsweek on December 30th, China demands U.S. end hostile military operations near its borders. This somewhat reflects one of the demands that Putin made to the United States in, his security proposal, which was to end the high-level war games in Eastern Europe, and this seems to be China essentially asking for the equivalent. In the United States, these war games are almost never talked about, and if they are, they're only talked about by some journalists who gets a special deployment on the U.S. aircraft carrier, and what they're there to do isn't to in any way report on what the U.S. forces are training for, really. It's mainly about, hey, cool, look at this new technology they have. Planes taking off on an aircraft carrier deck. This is the F-35. This is the F-18. These are the new lifts they have. This is, a nuclear-powered vessel. And then, maybe there's a little bit of, we got to do this to check China in the region. And they'll ask a few troops and they'll talk about checking China and making sure that the trade lanes stay open. Or, if it's in Russia, they're countering the Russian aggression. But there's never any actual concern about like how much these things cost, if they're really necessary, what strategically does the U.S. gain from this? Does it actually create more problems for the U.S.? Because just like if Mexico was carrying out joint military drills with Russia in northern Mexico, and China was carrying out military drills, with an entire aircraft carrier strike force. We're talking about an aircraft carrier and 5 guided missile destroyers and several other frigates and support ships and everything like that. If China was doing that in the Gulf of Mexico, we would absolutely lose our mind, see that as a hostile action, and then look to build up militarily to make sure that these war games can never turn into an attack on the United States. And that's exactly how China and Russia react to the U.S. War games. And so we should really, try to tone them down at the very least. They don't have to be right off of Russia's coast, or they happen in the Black Sea, so off of Russia's coast there, but they don't have to be right off of China's coast in the Sea of Japan, the South China Sea, the Taiwan Strait, all these other, the Sea of Korea and things like that. And that, probably could ratchet down the tension level of these games quite a bit. But again, I don't think that's the point. I think these war games are meant to, or at least the people who recommend, like the Rand corporations and everything, who are suggesting we need to play these war games and everything like that. And for the military, I'm sure it's good for their budgets, making sure that they get all the fancy new equipment, they get to try it out and everything like that. But, these war games really create a need for more war games based on the logic of the war games themselves. And if we cut them out, we could probably save a hell of a lot of money and really reduce tensions with a lot of countries, not just Russia and China, but also like Iran. The U.S., as far as I know, didn't respond to this proposal directly, but they did carry out the Sea Dragon 22 war games with Australia, Canada, India, Japan, and the U.S. being Korea, so being 6-nation war games, and these begun on January 5th. And so I actually think I should correct myself. That proposal was made from China to the United States during a meeting between, I think, people of the Indo-Pac, the U.S. Pacific Command there, and then equivalent Chinese military ranking official or something. And so that I actually talked about those on the show in mid-December, and then it was reported towards the end of December that proposal had been passed along. And then again, a week after it comes public, the U.S. carries out these war games. They say that these war games are mainly focused on anti-submarine warfare, 270 hours of in-flight training, all kinds of other, crazy technology. I'm sure a lot of spending going on here, and obviously something that's going to upset China, cause China to, look for more military options, build new military technology, and then the United States is going to say, oh my God, China's building up militarily, now we need to as well. Australia and Japan have signed a new defense and security cooperation treaty, and this seems to be quite significant. The agreement was signed, I think, between the defense ministers although the prime ministers of the two countries didn't meet. There's some good analysis on this by Shireng Shidora, and that he is writing at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. And actually, I didn't get a chance to listen to it before I did the show, but Kelly Vallejos and Dan Larison have him on to talk about this for the first episode of their show in 2022. I think it's Crashing the War Party is the name of their new show. I'm sorry, Kelly, Dan, you changed the name of your show and I forgot. I just subscribe and, get the feed, but it's an absolutely fantastic show and a must read or listen to if you follow U.S. foreign policy. But in this article, Shireng makes the argument that the signing of the Reciprocal Access Agreement between Japan and Australia today marks another step forward in weaving together of an China containment coalition in the Asia Pacific. The agreement allows the militaries of both countries to develop deep access into each other's air bases, ports, logistics, and infrastructure facilities. It will thus make it easier for troops from both countries to train, exercise, and operate together in any future war with China. The latest pact is a part of a wider arc of informal and formal security arrangements known as multilaterals that the United States has led or backed in Asia. Australia is emerging as the most reliable U.S. partner in almost all these arrangements, with membership in the Quad, that's the U.S., Japan, Australia, India, AUKUS, that's Australia, UK, US, and the Trilateral Security Dialogue, and I think they call that the Trident, and that's the US, Australia, and Japan. Australia seems eager to take on a role as Washington's most consequential subordinate to stop China's rise. And he talks about the possibility of then extending AUKUS to include Japan or something like that, as Australia pulls more of these countries in to the security dialogues. And they're not just the US and Australia. There's also Canada and Australia. There's also now Japan and Australia, and then there's Australia, India, Japan, Japan and India, and all these different arrangements and everything. But Australia, as he is pointing out, is a key in all of them. So that's something important to keep your eye on if there is an Japan inclusion into AUKUS. Taiwan is ready for deeper ties with the United States. This by Dave DeCamp on December 29th, right at the end of the year. Taiwan ready for deeper military ties with the U.S. after Biden signs the NDAA. This was basically Taiwan's response to the NDAA, that they were very happy about it. Remember that the Taiwanese government that's currently in control is very pro-independence, and so that the fact that they're voicing support for the NDAA makes me suspect that they're very happy with it because they believe it'll help advance, their independence and separation from China, U.S. tensions with China remaining high in that case. The U.S. has also signed a new pact with Japan to launch, and it's a new research and development agreement. So the United States and Japan will sign a new research agreement and development agreement to make it easier to collaborate on countering new defense threats. And, that's basically just China, but they highlighted including hypersonics and space-based capabilities. And, those are the two big concerns that they're making now. The deep state that we have to worry about are hypersonics and space. Last story on China here, and that is Japan is planning to increase its Coast Guard by 10 ships to carry out more patrols over the Senkaku Islands. These are islands about 400 kilometers from Japan, and also claimed by Taiwan, which is much closer, 170 kilometers away, and then also China, which is 330 kilometers away. And the U.S. has said that its mutual defense treaty with Japan extends to the Senkaku Islands, and this is really about, I think, territorial claims like water claims, fishing claims, and natural gas and rights like to drilling and things like that in the region. They think there's natural gas there. And so this is pretty concerning that Japan is going to be carrying out more patrols there, because that's likely going to increase conflict with China there, and the U.S. has signed on to defend Japan over those islands if they create a conflict with China. Now let's talk about Yemen. Worst thing happening, and it continues to get worse. This is from Jason Ditz at antiwar.com. He writes, Saudis force Yemen-bound fuel ship to Saudi port. He says, tensions are further rising in the Red Sea as the fuel ship Splendid Sapphire, due to dock in Hodeidah, which is the key port in Yemen, has been diverted by Saudi naval forces and compelled to dock in Saudi Arabia. Yemen Petroleum Company says this makes 5 fuel ships, all which had UN security clearance, which are now being held by the Saudi-led coalition. The Saudi naval blockade has them seized or delaying most anything valuable bound for Yemen. This has left shortages not just in fuel but food and medicine as well. Hodeidah remains the last port in Houthi-held northern Yemen and has effectively the only way to get goods in, with the Sana'a airport badly damaged. The State Department made no further comment on the fuel ship, instead complaining about the Houthis capturing a ship full of weapons earlier in this week, demanding that the Houthis immediately release it. And that ship that we're talking about, we covered on the show, I believe, the episode with me and Connor Freeman, and it was a part of, or maybe seems to be a part of, a coordinated response to the 2-year assassination of Qasem Soleimani. So, Yemen, absolutely horrible what's happening there right now, and it's only going to be made worse if these fuel ships aren't able to get to the port. Now, the Saudis made some other excuse for the ships not getting to the port, but at this point, the humanitarian crisis there is so bad, there's really no excuse for depriving Yemen of that fuel. Another really important story on Yemen here, and I'll explain all of it in a second. This is from Al Jazeera. Saudi Arabia could run out of interceptor missiles for its U.S.-made Patriot air defense systems in months, according to a senior U.S. official cited by the Financial Times. So this is very important because the Houthis have the ability to fire missiles and, some homemade drones and stuff like that at Saudi Arabia. I think these missiles and drones are probably pretty cheap to manufacture, although, resources are pretty limited in Yemen, so cheap might be relative there, but they're not super expensive. I don't think they have like cruise missiles or really anything guided. Most of it are just ballistic missiles or drones. And Saudi Arabia has been using the very expensive U.S. Patriot missiles to intercept them, and essentially made sure that its population faces no consequence for its brutal war in Yemen. Not that the princes are necessarily responsive to their people or anything like that, but if there are missiles raining down in Saudi Arabia that may provoke the government to negotiate more, or if the Houthis were able to target their missiles at government infrastructure, things that bring the princes a lot of money, or potentially any kind of royal family real estate or something like that, maybe these are the kinds of things that could really prompt the Saudis to feel like there's a consequence to, keeping up the war in Yemen, because there's really nothing else. Like, they could just bomb the Houthis all day, and the Houthis really can't respond other than these missiles. And so without the Patriot missile systems, the Saudis may face real consequences for their war in Yemen and have to seek some kind of resolution with the Houthis. It was reported in that Al Jazeera article that they brought this up with other Gulf Arab states. They brought it up in the GCC meeting. And so, this would suggest that maybe they're looking to Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, the UAE, or Qatar for more of these missiles, or maybe a country closely aligned with any of them. I'm not sure how many of these countries. I kind of doubt Oman does. Maybe like Bahrain has one because the Fifth Fleet is there, or the Al Udeid air base is in Qatar. But I don't know if these are like munitions that these governments actually have access to. My guess is that Saudi Arabia will have to come to the U.S. for it. And if we're prepared in the United States, this may be something that can be blocked. And it would be huge if that were the case. Now, they just had a missile sale go through. And so these being interceptors and defensive missiles and all that, I'm sure it's going to be a little bit of an easier argument in Congress. But if people are standing strong and making a big deal about it, this may be a real chance for the people of America to influence what is happening in Yemen. And so months from now, that could be more, it could be less. I think we're going to see this fight happen in the United States, and it's going to be our next chance to really fight against this war. All right. So on the ground in Yemen, the fighting is going on in the Mareb province, in the Shabwa province that is just south of Mareb. The Saudis are claiming to kill scores of Houthis, and hundreds at times in a single day. They're carrying out dozens of airstrikes, so it's absolutely possible. If you listen to the numbers even the Houthis put out, it seems possible that this is actually the case. Although the Houthis have, since probably April when they launched the offensive, taken most of Mareb, Yemen. And so despite the massive losses on the Houthi side, they've been able to make progress. Now, you don't get the same reporting on the number of government soldiers killed. Maybe that's because the Houthis don't have access to press that's putting that out, or maybe the Houthis, for whatever reason, aren't reporting it as much, or the Houthis aren't killing Saudi soldiers, not Saudi bad soldiers. They not necessarily Yemenis. They could be like Sudanese mercenaries or something like that, but soldiers on the Saudi side of the conflict, and most of the time, I'm guessing, aren't actually Saudi nationals at all. And so they claim to have made some progress, though, on January 2nd, turning back in the Mareb province, although, to what extent this is actually true and just propaganda, I'm not sure. Then the Houthis, the next day, or 2 days later, I believe, just the next day, reported that another 78 fighters were killed on the ground there in Mareb. And the day after, or no, this one's 2 days after, I think this one comes January 5th, we have the report of 200 killed in fighting around Yemen's Mareb. So just so many people being killed. This last report from Jason Ditz and antiwar.com did mention that some of those killed were among the Saudi bad side, but not exactly clear, if these numbers, how accurate they are, but it probably does represent that a lot of people are getting killed. Now, Saudi Arabia is not just bombing Marib in the areas with heavy fighting. It's also bombing the capital of Yemen. There's no fighting. Nobody is contesting Sana'a. The reason Saudi Arabia is bombing Sana'a, they say, is to target things that are launching missiles or drones or manufacturing missiles or drones at Saudi Arabia. But it could just be to inflict pain and suffering on the civilians of Yemen who live in Sana'a, who are away, when the area is away from the fighting, but yet they regularly are just rained on by American-made bombs by Saudi pilots flying American-made planes. Let's see, anything else on Yemen I wanted to mention? Oh, yeah, just with the increase in fighting. Now, remember, we're talking about scores of people being killed and everything like that, but I'm guessing that not everybody who's being hit by the Saudi airstrikes is ending up dead. That means more people going to medical facilities and putting more and more strain on a medical system that's already very, very strained. And so if you're taking away the resources and supplies because there's heavy fighting going on the ground, that may mean, less supplies, less equipment, and less room for the children or anybody else in Yemen who's just, dying or suffering with other medical causes that are unrelated to the fighting going on, things like cholera, malnutrition. I mean, I guess they're related in that the fighting is causing that in the first place, but, it's not like you're missing a leg or something from a bomb. I'm not talking. All right, let's move on and talk about Israel real quick before we wrap up here. There's some just awful things going on to the Palestinians there. This story from Mondo Weiss is great. They do this thing where they kind of let Palestinians and particularly Gazans write a story about just, what life is like. And so this is this girl, Noor Anga, who is trying to get medical treatment, and she lives in Gaza. And so, she goes to the Gazan hospital and they say, we don't have the technology to treat what you got going on. And so her and her mother, she's 23 years old. So she's not a kid, but she's, for if you're going through a medical condition, has a lot of migraines and all that, like, if people have had severe migraines know that this could absolutely be debilitating what she's going through. And so then she ends up getting accepted to go to a hospital, but her mother was rejected. And so then she decided to apply again, this time with her aunt, and they were both accepted. But now, we're at 5 months after her diagnosis. She, one thing she talks about going through security. So leaving Gaza and going into Israel, and how the toothpaste that she had, right? They said that she couldn't bring her toothpaste in, but they wouldn't let her throw her toothpaste away just at the checkpoint. They made her literally go outside the building and throw her toothpaste back into Gaza, right? Like, the people of Gaza are so dehumanized in the eyes of the Israeli customs enforcement that even their toothpaste would contaminate the Israeli land. And so they have to go and throw it back into Gaza. She talks about how she never realized how far away Israel was from Gaza, or actually, I guess, how close it was. She had always thought it was very far. And once, she got into Israel, was able to go to Jerusalem and pray at the Al-Aqsa Mosque and everything like that. And just imagine that what it would be like if you had a really significant to you, religious building or something like that, right? And it's right down the road, and you're not allowed to go unless you have some kind of crazy brain tumor, because no regular people are just allowed out of Gaza to go and travel to the Al-Aqsa Mosque or anything like that. And so, it's this crazy thing where it's only because of that she's even able to, like, leave. Oh, one other thing, she mentions that her aunt wasn't allowed to bring her psoriasis cream with her, that was denied at the Israeli checkpoint and everything like that. So she ends up, I think, getting the surgery in Turkey after it was kind of decided that they couldn't do the surgery for her in the West Bank either. But as she was coming back into Gaza, right, they decide not to do the surgery. Her and her aunt are bringing a few pounds of cheese, and they make them throw the cheese away. And so, just another little delicacy, a little way to, like, bring back a little bit of the rest of the world into Gaza, for her aunt and their brothers and sisters and everything like that, for her family. It gets thrown away in an Israeli trash can. And again, it just seems so clear that this is just about punishing people. It has nothing to do with security or anything like that. The goal is to make the people of Gaza as miserable possible, and I guess hopefully just all die off one day, and that way they don't have to deal with them anymore and could just claim all the land as their own. But right now they just keep them penned up in a big prison, and even if you have real medical issues, you probably the Unabomber or somebody in the U.S. is probably getting more quality medical care than a lot of these people in Gaza are seeking in Israel, and probably more likely to get access to it when you think about, like, applying and everything like that, what you have to go through. So many stories of young children having to go, with non-relatives to get their medical care because their dad, their mom, their brothers, and everybody were rejected when they applied to travel with their kid to get medical care. Israel is also holding up critical water and sewage parts that are needed in Gaza. So after the latest bombing campaign, a lot of the water and sewage system is damaged. And I'm sure just over time you're not able to, like, bring in things to upgrade this, and it goes bad, right? Like these systems don't last forever, but especially when you're in a war zone. And so now Israel is further delaying when they are going to allow these systems into Gaza. And I've talked about on the show how many of the health problems in Gaza are caused by people drinking unclean water. And, this is just making it worse. And again, just like Saudi Arabia not allowing the fuel into Yemen, this is just to punish the people and make their lives more miserable. And hopefully, I guess, like, the end goal being dying off our complete subservience. We also have this now in the West Bank, a few tragic stories. Israeli bulldozers plowed the way through wheat fields to make room for Israeli tanks. I mean, there's really no other way to describe what happened here other than this is just the things that happen when you live in apartheid states. You know, when you treat the other people as absolute dogs, then when they plant their crops, you go and bulldoze their fields and then run tanks over them. Demolishing wheat fields. You know, these are things that people are going to eat. This isn't like anybody growing pot or anything like that. This is people growing food that they're going to eat and to feed themselves and their neighbors so they don't starve to death and die. And an Israeli tank comes and destroys it, along with Israeli bulldozers. Like, there's no other way to get around the West Bank, or that you have to be moving the tanks around constantly. But this is what Israeli does, again, to make sure that the Palestinians stay poor and desperate and have nothing, and, eventually just leave or die. We also have a massive number of night raids being carried out by Israeli forces. There was 20 reported in one night, but in the course of events that I'm not exactly sure what all of them were, you had a tow truck driving down the road, working with the Israeli military, and an activist standing on the side of the road, a 75-year-old man, and he was run down by that truck. Now, it was reported at the time, this story came out a few days ago now, that he was just in critical condition, but at that age, being hit by a tow truck, I don't know what the chances are that you're going to survive. According to witnesses, that tow truck did deliberately hit the old man, swerved out of the way to hit him. It wasn't a situation like he threw himself in front of the truck to try to prevent it from going. All right, last story on today's show, and that is the current foreign minister of Israel, Yair Lapid, who is set to become the prime minister in 2023, vows no negotiations with Palestinians once he becomes the president, and says that there's going to be no talks on the two-state solution. Now, it would be one thing to say, I'm not going to talk about a two-state solution, because what we need to do right here in Israel is give the Palestinians rights. We're going to treat them like people, and Israeli, Palestinian, doesn't matter. Everybody is going to be, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of work to be done, but we're going to start to take the steps to make us a less apartheid and racist society. But that's not what he's saying. He's saying that we're just not going to talk to the Palestinians about a two-state solution, so they can't have their own state, but yet we're going to make sure they continue to live under our military occupation, in our military courts and everything like that. All right, everybody, that's the show for today. Hope you enjoyed it. Share the show, Libertarian Institute, and check out antiwar.com. I do the viewpoints there. Donate, Patreon, subscribe star, crypto information, and the information for the sponsor, Paloma Verde, all in the show notes page. So go find some way to support the show. If you can't do it financially, at least share the show. Thanks, everyone.